We talk about chapter 5 about the pre-reading strategies or the before reading strategies, focusing on building prior knowledge and vocabulary. So why really do we do these strategies? Why do we care about activating prior knowledge? And if you haven't heard it enough already, prior knowledge is very important for students to build upon in their new learning and their new understanding. If they don't have that schema to start with, then they won't have anything to connect it to. And so our author says that there's a strong reciprocal relationship between prior knowledge and comprehension. So if you have prior knowledge, then you are more easily able to comprehend the information. If you don't have prior knowledge, then it is a lot more difficult for students to understand what they read. And I love this quote on page 30. She says, the more middle school readers comprehend, the more information they learn, and the greater the background knowledge they have to bring to a variety of reading materials. So it's kind of like a snowball effect. The more they read, or the more the knowledge they have, the more they understand, the more they read, and they just keep building on that. So even though it's very tempting to just kind of move right on past these before reading strategies, don't do that. You need to know what your students know. And they can actually be the most important as a gateway to learning. In other words, if students don't have prior knowledge, then the learning is stopped or halted or made more frustrating and difficult for them to do. So make sure and just do some type of before reading strategy to get to know what your students know. Okay, so vocabulary is another one of those things that is hugely important, has a lot to do with prior knowledge, because students learn and build up their vocabulary based on their prior experiences. So if a middle school student has never heard anything about the Holocaust or anything like that, when you start talking about concentration camps and the different names of the camps, which I cannot even pronounce them very well, but Adolf Hitler and about the Jews and anti-Semitism, all of those words can be actually a barrier to learning. And so you need to have some type of strategies to help your kids learn some vocabulary. So based on this chart on page 131, here are some research-based methods that we know work. You need to make connections, and that seems to be like the foundational thing in this class, is making sure students make connections to things they know. So stories, concepts, so they need to have a new word, have something to connect it to, and maybe even a visual that will help them remember. They need to be able to see these words lots of times. So when we talked about before, and it's later on in this presentation, but gathering a lot of materials on the same theme, kids can read a lot of the same words in those materials, but they're in different contexts, so they need to see the same words over and over to help them kind of internalize the understanding. Also, help them with word study. I know this is kind of difficult sometimes, but I don't think we realize how much this really impacts how we understand things. I mean, if students know how to break down word parts, then they can figure out a word in context without having to ask somebody else or look it up. But words like, or roots and affixes, like an affix such as a prefix, such as dis. I mean, if you say disappoint or disengage, or students are going to know that has a negative connotation to it because they understand what dis means. Or ed as a ending means past tense normally. So just students knowing those things helps them dramatically in their reading and understanding. And also the other thing, which just seems like a given, because students learn the majority of vocabulary knowledge actually just reading. The majority of vocabulary is not done with dictionaries and writing out definitions, because that is very out of context. There's no connection to the real reading. And so it's important that kids just read a lot, and so having a lot of different texts on the same subject is really important. So definitely start vocabulary building before you read. So here's some other suggestions with prior knowledge and vocabulary. Like I just said, gather lots of materials. Do lots of read alouds. When students listen to you read parts of a novel or even a picture book or an article or a maybe a little short news story or blurb, then they learn that vocabulary and connect it to what you guys are talking about. Also, lots of photographs and works of art are online. They're archived online. There's so many resources there. You can pull up artworks that deal with the historical time period you're talking about, and students can see that visual. It's very important to have that visual to connect to. A lot of students are very visual in their learning, so that can be helpful. And also just online resources. I started listing some, but really there are so many that are out there. There's really not a reason to not use technology when you're talking about instruction anymore. There's so many online resources, and you really need to check them out. Here are some other considerations to keep in mind. It's really important when you're talking about these before reading strategies that students have time to share information and personal connections. They need to verbalize that or write it down, and we'll talk about literature response journals in just a minute, but they need to share it with each other. They need to share in their writing. They need to share a whole group. Just let them have a lot of time to talk and share. They also need to hear you doing that through think alouds, and then they need to talk with their peers about a new genre, a new topic, whatever that is that you're introducing. Help them to get their information out there and on the chart that you're going to be making. Then it will help you know if prior knowledge is lacking, that you need to build it up. You need to do some more with some of those pre-reading strategies to help your students. And then also, after you have done the before reading strategy, you have made a chart, you've documented your thinking, encourage students to go back and review that and see what they've learned after you've made the chart. Literature response journals, this can be done with a blog online too. Kids like to have that because then they can read and respond to each other, or outside people, an authentic audience can read, or they can be private blogs that are just between you and the student. These are really stories of students thinking, which I love because, as you can see, I'm all about getting to know your student and their strengths and their weaknesses. So this can be a way that students can give you a lot of information about what they need, about how they're thinking. And then it helps them just document their thinking and learning. Sometimes students learn through writing things that they hadn't really thought about before. And so this is a good way to be able to do that. And this is the end of this lecture. And if you will actually read through the strategy lesson framework on page 137, and then just look at some of the example strategies that the author has starting on page 139, we are actually going to look at some of those examples in class. We're going to dissect them and analyze them so you guys will be able to use them to help you write your own reading strategy presentation framework. And that's it.